A private conversation that unfolded not over weeks of careful diplomacy, but in 17 minutes of raw, unfiltered confrontation. 17 minutes that altered the trajectory of a war. 17 minutes that redefined American credibility on the world stage. 17 minutes that left Vladimir Putin, according to sources who have now spoken, genuinely uncertain for the first time since February 2022. What President Joe Biden said during that call crossed a line that previous administrations had hoped would never need to be drawn. And when that line was drawn, Putin did not dismiss it. He responded with silence, recalculation, and what intelligence officials now describe as a fundamental reassessment of American resolve. The words Biden used that day have remained classified, buried in the most secure communication logs of the National Security Council, until now. Tonight, through exclusive access to officials who were present during and immediately after that call, we can finally reveal what was said, why it was said, and how those 17 minutes changed the course of the war in Ukraine. This is the story that Washington didn't want told. This is the threat that Moscow never expected. And this is the moment that historians may one day point to as the turning point in the most dangerous confrontation between nuclear powers since the Cuban Missile Crisis. For months leading up to that call, there had been signals, not public statements, not official diplomatic channels, just signals, that Vladimir Putin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain logic, a pattern, almost a predictability that Western intelligence agencies had learned to read. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and across NATO capitals that autumn was that the pattern went silent. Analysts who monitor Russian military doctrine know the indicators: the positioning of tactical nuclear assets, the communication frequencies between the Kremlin and Strategic Command, the movement of key decision-makers to secure facilities, the sudden cessation of normal military exercises. All of that went quiet. And whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. The Biden administration had watched Russia's conventional forces struggle in Ukraine. They had seen the failed advances, the logistical disasters, the humiliating retreats from Kharkiv and later from Kherson. They had also seen something else. They had seen a leader backed into a corner, a leader whose domestic political survival depended on a victory he could not achieve through conventional means. A leader who had, on multiple occasions, publicly invoked Russia's nuclear doctrine in ways that made even his own generals uncomfortable. Intelligence assessments delivered to the Oval Office during this period painted a concerning picture. Putin was not behaving like a leader who intended to negotiate. He was behaving like a leader who was preparing to escalate. The question facing President Biden was not whether Putin would consider using tactical nuclear weapons. The question was what, if anything, could stop him. Early one morning in late October 2022, the National Security Agency detected what they described as anomalous communication patterns emanating from Russian Strategic Command, including encrypted traffic that had not been activated in over 3 decades. These are the kinds of protocols that Russia only uses when they are signaling something very specific: preparation for strategic action, testing of command and control systems, or communication of final orders. Analysts at the NSA and CIA didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all 3 at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his nuclear posture. And when a nuclear-armed state shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, the United States pays attention. Within hours, an emergency briefing was convened in the Situation Room. Present were Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley, and CIA Director William Burns. The intelligence they reviewed was, according to one official present, the most alarming assessment of Russian nuclear intentions since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Satellite imagery showed movement at a facility in Kaliningrad that housed nuclear-capable Iskander missiles. Communication intercepts suggested discussions at the highest levels of the Russian military about demonstrative options, a term that in Russian strategic doctrine refers to limited nuclear use designed to shock an adversary into submission. President Biden listened to the briefing in silence. When it concluded, he asked a single question: what happens if we don't respond? The answer, delivered by General Milley, was stark. Then we lose Ukraine, we lose NATO credibility, and we potentially lose the post-World War II order. Biden nodded. Then he said, "Get me Putin on a secure line." The message delivered by President Biden during that call was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was existential. Officials who were briefed on the conversation immediately afterward described Biden's tone as controlled, unambiguous, and perhaps most importantly, personal in a way that Putin had never experienced from an American president. Biden did not speak in the language of diplomatic communiques. He did not invoke international law or coalition consensus. He spoke directly to Putin as one leader to another, as one man who understood power to another who had miscalculated it. According to multiple sources with direct knowledge of the call, Biden began by acknowledging what both men knew, that Russia was preparing options for tactical nuclear use in Ukraine. He did not ask Putin to confirm or deny this. He simply stated it as fact. Then Biden made clear what the American response would be. The exact words remain classified at the highest levels of national security, but officials who have been briefed describe them as the most direct nuclear threat ever issued by an American president in a private communication. Biden reportedly told Putin that any use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, tactical, demonstrative, or otherwise, would result in consequences that would not be limited to economic sanctions. He reportedly told Putin that the United States had already prepositioned assets that would ensure the complete destruction of Russian military forces in and around Ukraine within 72 hours. He reportedly told Putin that this response would not require nuclear weapons, that American conventional capabilities alone were sufficient to end Russia's war-fighting capacity. And then, according to sources, Biden said something that stunned even his own advisors. He told Putin, "You may survive this war. Your military will not. Your economy will not. And your legacy will not. You will be remembered as the man who destroyed Russia, not because America wanted that, but because you chose it." Tonight, former officials confirmed that Biden's threat was not a bluff. In the hours before that call, Secretary Austin had ordered the forward deployment of B-2 stealth bombers to undisclosed locations in Europe. The aircraft were armed with conventional precision munitions capable of striking deep into Russian-held territory. Additionally, the Navy had repositioned 2 carrier strike groups into the eastern Mediterranean, not as a show of force, but as an operational necessity. These weren't the routine deployments that Russia had grown accustomed to monitoring. These were combat-ready assets. Systems that the United States only deploys when they are preparing to engage in sustained military operations. Biden's threat to Putin was backed by the ability to destroy Russian air defenses across Ukraine within 24 hours, the capacity to eliminate Russian logistics and supply lines within 48 hours, the means to render the Black Sea Fleet combat ineffective within 72 hours. In other words, Biden was threatening to replay the Gulf War, but against a nuclear-armed adversary. The audacity of this threat cannot be overstated. Biden was telling Putin that the United States was prepared to go to war, conventional war, against Russia if Putin crossed the nuclear threshold. He was telling Putin that escalation would not favor Russia. He was telling Putin that the only way Russia survives as a functioning state is if Putin steps back from the brink. And according to officials who monitored Russian communications in the hours after that call, Putin understood. The anomalous traffic from Russian Strategic Command went silent. The movement at the Kaliningrad facility stopped. And within 72 hours, Russian state media, which had been increasingly discussing nuclear options, suddenly stopped mentioning them altogether, and here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence officials now believe that Putin's nuclear signaling was designed to test the resolve of the Biden administration after the midterm elections. Putin wanted to see whether Washington would falter, whether domestic political divisions would weaken American commitment, whether Europe would pressure Biden to seek a negotiated settlement on Russian terms. But instead, the opposite happened. Biden didn't seek off-ramps for Putin. He delivered an ultimatum that was so direct, so credible, and so consequential that even Russian hardliners noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But that day, Biden did. Former intelligence officers speaking with our team under anonymity described Putin's reaction as genuine recalibration, a recognition that he had fundamentally misread the American president. Putin had believed that Biden was weak. Putin had believed that an aging president facing political headwinds at home would not risk direct confrontation. Putin had believed that nuclear threats would create space for Russian advances, but Biden proved that he remained both capable and willing. His threat was not only credible, It was delivered so precisely that Russian intelligence could verify every element of it within hours. That verification matters because it shows Russian analysts checking Biden's claims and finding them accurate. It shows that Biden was not posturing. It shows that the United States was genuinely prepared for what would have been the most significant military confrontation since World War II. As reports continued emerging throughout the following weeks, we learned more about the scale of American preparation. Strategic Command had elevated readiness levels at nuclear facilities across the continental United States, ensuring that any Russian first strike would be met with overwhelming retaliation. U.S. Cyber Command had pre-positioned offensive capabilities targeting Russian infrastructure that had been developed but never deployed over the previous decade. Special operations forces operating in Eastern Europe had reportedly identified and mapped Russian command and control nodes in occupied Ukraine. This wasn't just deterrence. This wasn't just signaling. This was operational preparation. This was war planning. And war planning is the one thing Putin had struggled to take seriously from Western powers since the fall of the Soviet Union. For every territorial advance Russia had made in Ukraine, the United States had countered with something that complicated Russian calculations. But this was different. This was Biden telling Putin, "We are not trying to prevent escalation. We are telling you what happens if you escalate." That shift from deterrence to conditional threat represented a fundamental change in American nuclear policy. And Putin, for the first time, took it seriously. Remember, Putin thought Biden was a transitional figure, a caretaker president who would avoid confrontation. He thought that American political divisions would paralyze decision-making. He thought that European dependence on Russian energy would fracture the Western alliance. He thought that nuclear threats would create fear, and fear would create concessions. But that October, the exact opposite happened. Biden unified NATO around the most significant collective defense posture since the Cold War. European nations accelerated their energy independence from Russia. And the nuclear threats that Putin believed would intimidate the West instead triggered the most direct American warning since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Putin had miscalculated. And for a leader who had built his reputation on strategic calculation, that miscalculation was devastating. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that Biden's threat happened at a time when Putin was under unprecedented domestic pressure. Russian nationalists wanted faster military advances and were criticizing the Kremlin's handling of the war. Russian oligarchs wanted the sanctions lifted and were quietly lobbying for negotiation. Russian military commanders wanted resources they weren't receiving and were increasingly frustrated with civilian interference. And the Russian public wanted to understand why a special military operation had become an endless war. Putin was balancing these demands while simultaneously losing territory in Ukraine. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. Biden understood this. His threat was calibrated not just to deter nuclear use, but to remind Putin that escalation would accelerate his domestic collapse, not prevent it. Biden was telling Putin, using nuclear weapons doesn't save you, it destroys you faster. The administration's internal assessment, now shared with select congressional leaders, was designed to signal that the United States was not willing to allow nuclear blackmail to succeed. Officials said plainly that Putin's nuclear posturing was inconsistent with the behavior of a responsible nuclear power. That is diplomatic language for, "We see what you're doing, and it will not work." You don't usually hear that tone from the White House unless something genuinely serious is at stake. Following the call, Biden briefed key allies personally. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, French President Emmanuel Macron, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz were all informed of what Biden had said and what intelligence had prompted it. Their responses, according to officials, were unanimous. Support for Biden's position and commitment to collective action if Russia crossed the nuclear threshold. For the first time since the war began, NATO was genuinely unified on the most dangerous question: what happens if Putin uses nuclear weapons? And that unity, perhaps more than any single weapon system, changed Putin's calculation. Meanwhile, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a somber, resolute speech that evening. He said, "We have faced every weapon Russia has used against us. We have not broken. We will not break." He said, "Our partners understand what is at stake. This is not just Ukraine's fight. This is the fight for the future of international order." And he said, "To those who threaten us with annihilation, we have heard such threats before. We are still here. We will remain here." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how close it came to nuclear catastrophe. And they are statements that reflected confidence, confidence that for the first time Ukraine's allies had drawn a clear line. Here's what makes the situation even more consequential. Biden's threat to Putin wasn't isolated, along with the direct warning. Secretary Blinken also delivered parallel messages to Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, making clear that any Chinese support for Russian nuclear use would fundamentally alter the U.S.-China relationship. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned financial institutions worldwide that secondary sanctions would follow any Russian escalation. Intelligence agencies increased surveillance of North Korean and Iranian communications with Moscow, looking for signs of nuclear coordination. All of this happened within the same 72-hour period. When the United States moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Biden wasn't just threatening Putin. He was restructuring the entire diplomatic and military landscape to ensure that nuclear use would have consequences beyond anything Russia could survive. Analysts are now considering several possibilities for why this threat worked when previous warnings had not. One is that Putin was genuinely preparing for nuclear use and was surprised by the specificity of American intelligence. Another is that Putin was testing Biden's resolve and received an answer far more forceful than expected. A third possibility, the one that has most intrigued scholars of nuclear deterrence, is that Putin recognized in Biden's words a leader who was genuinely prepared to accept the consequences of escalation. Previous American warnings had emphasized the catastrophic nature of nuclear war, implicitly suggesting that the United States feared such an outcome. Biden's threat inverted that logic. He didn't say nuclear war would be terrible for everyone. He said nuclear war would be worse for you than for us, and I am prepared to prove it. That shift from mutual fear to asymmetric consequence was something Putin had not anticipated, and faced with that calculus, Putin blinked. What we witnessed in those October days was a test of deterrence. Putin wanted to see whether nuclear threats could compel Western concessions. Biden wanted to show that nuclear threats would accelerate Western resolve. NATO wanted to prevent any use of nuclear weapons that would require a response, and the entire international system wanted to prevent the first combat use of nuclear weapons since Nagasaki. All of these objectives were in tension. All of them could have failed. The fact that they didn't, that Putin stepped back, that nuclear weapons remained unused, that the war continued at the conventional level, represents one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of the 21st century. And it happened because one man, in one conversation, said words that his adversary could not ignore. Tonight, we've heard from officials who are now monitoring the long-term effects of that October conversation. They say Putin has not returned to explicit nuclear threats since that call. They say Russian military doctrine discussions have shifted away from tactical nuclear options. And they say Putin's decision to avoid nuclear escalation is likely part of a broader recognition that such escalation would end his regime, not save it. But the story doesn't end there. Russia has continued its conventional war in Ukraine. Thousands continue to die, cities continue to be destroyed, and the threat of escalation, while diminished, has not disappeared. What Biden's threat achieved was not peace. It was the prevention of something far worse. It was the drawing of a line that, once crossed, would have changed the world forever. And Putin, whatever else may be said about him, understood that Biden meant every word. As the months have passed, more details have emerged about what exactly Biden hoped to achieve with that call. But what we do know is that the threat was timely. It prevented what intelligence agencies believed was an imminent escalation. It unified Western allies around a clear and credible response. And it demonstrated that American deterrence, when properly communicated, can still prevent the unthinkable. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the coming years. If he continues to avoid nuclear escalation, this moment will be remembered as the point where American deterrence held. If he eventually tests that line again, Biden and his successors have already shown they are prepared to respond. They have shown they are ready to act. They have shown that the words spoken in private can have consequences that reshape the world. And tonight, for the first time since that October conversation, the full scope of what Biden said is becoming public. The Kremlin has been quiet about these revelations. Too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is weighing his next move carefully. Because that October, Putin learned something he had not fully understood before. That Joe Biden was not the weak leader Putin had assumed, that the United States was prepared for consequences Putin had not anticipated, and that the words spoken between leaders in moments of crisis can change the course of history. This story is far from over. The war in Ukraine continues, Putin remains in power, and the nuclear question, while deferred, has not been resolved. But tonight, one thing is clear. When it mattered most, an American president found the words that stopped a potential nuclear catastrophe. When it mattered most, deterrence worked, and when it mattered most, the world stepped back from the brink. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.